Good morning from here in New York. I'm Joshua Walker with Japan Society. I'm particularly excited for today's conversation. Whether you're waking up early in the morning here on the East Coast or you're joining us late at night in Asia, you won't want to miss today's conversation when we talk about the challenges and the opportunities for U.S. Japan-Korea trade relations. We have an all-star panel, and even more importantly, we have the three most important organizations focused on this region of the world, from Japan Society, Korea Society, and Asia Society. But before I turn it over to our illustrious moderator, who I'll introduce, to remind you, we're going to be talking about how these three countries can work together on shared opportunities, particularly on the economic realm. And the speakers today have a lot to discuss, whether it's the first two visits to the White House, which were Japan and Korea, or whether it's about the COVID pandemic and the economic implications in the Trans-Pacific areas. There's so much to discuss. So my job is to simply thank you all for joining us, to thank our sponsors, including the Japan Society, Citi, and Deloitte, business policy sponsors, Mizuho and Toyota, but more importantly, the Korea Society and then Asia Society's Policy Institute. The last time we did this was right after the pandemic began. I'm so excited that we're able to come together and bring such a meaningful program to you all. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Tom Byrne, who will be moderating. He's obviously the president and CEO of the Korea Society, but he's also a longtime expert in this particular field, where he came from Moody Risk and he focused in the Asia Pacific with a lot of his career. So with that, Tom, let me turn it over to you and say thank you again for this great partnership.
Well, thanks, Josh. It's great to see you, even though I'm looking forward to seeing you in person one of these days. We've started to open up, actually, here at the Korea Society. The Korea Society is very happy to partner with the Japan Society and the Asia Society, the Asia Society's Policy Institute. And we're also grateful for our supporters, namely the Korea Foundation and a number of large corporations as well. The goal of this session is to provide you, our audience, a better understanding of the dynamics of the U.S. Japan-Korea trade relations, and also the regional economic and trade integration that's going on. It's my pleasure to introduce, as Josh said, three all-stars, three renowned experts who are today's speakers. Professor Wonhyuk Lim is a professor at the Korea Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management. Currently, he's also an adjunct lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. After the 2002 presidential election in Korea, he worked for the Presidential Transition Committee and the Presidential Committee on Northeast Asia. And he was formerly at Brookings as a CNAPS fellow. Wendy Cutler is vice president at the Asia Society Policy Institute, otherwise known as ASPI, and the managing director of the Washington, D.C. office. She previously served nearly 3 decades as a diplomat negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, where she worked on a range of negotiations and initiatives, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. Shujiro Urata-san is a professor emeritus at Waseda University. Before joining Waseda University in 1986, he was research associate at the Brookings Institution and an economist at the World Bank. He is currently affiliated with the Economic Research Institute for East Asia and ASEAN, Asian Development Bank Institute, and Japan Center for Economic Research. So we'll have several rounds of questions, and I'll kick this off with asking each commentator to discuss the regional priorities of the U.S., Japan, and Korea. What are the major challenges that these countries face, and what also are the opportunities? I've noticed, looking at recent data, that the East Asian economies are rebounding from the effects of the pandemic. Real-time trade data shows pretty strong increases in all three economies that we're talking about today: Japan, Korea, and the U.S. Purchasing managers indexes are up, industrial production is up, and so it looks like the regional economy, including the U.S., the Pacific regional economies are poised for strong growth. But looking ahead, what are the regional trade priorities? And maybe I could start with Wendy Cutler.
Well, thanks so much, Tom and Joshua. And just on behalf of the Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute, I think this is great that we're doing a program together on such important issue. And I hope that, we'll continue this collaboration going forward. And it's great to join my partners from Korea and Japan as well. It's interesting, Tom, the question you're asking, I should be able to give a simple answer. But when you ask me what are the Biden administration's trade priorities in the region, I think my answer is yet they still need to be articulated. It's a work in progress. We know the Biden administration's overall policy towards the Indo-Pacific region, and that is to re-engage, to show leadership, to promote the rules-based system, to deal with the challenges that China's bringing to the global stage, and to work closely with our allies and partners to continue to build, this system that has worked for us. But when it comes to trade, this is where things are a bit in flux and really they're still being developed in Washington. And that is that we have a real shift in our trade policy, one that is being called a worker-centered trade policy, which doesn't just mean more American jobs. It really has to do more with livelihood, with the communities in the United States, and with raising the livelihood of the middle class in America. And as a result, our trade policy is no longer really centered about opening other markets. It seems to be more centered about addressing the concerns, priorities, and interests of the working and middle class. This policy is evolving, and some of the aspects I would just underscore is that in many respects, the trade policy is going to be clearly aligned with the domestic priorities of the Biden administration, including climate change, resilient supply chains, and other related issues. It's not going to be focused on new trade negotiations. And I think you're going to see a lot of focus on enforcement of existing obligations and taking steps to make sure that trade is fair, particularly when it comes to China. So in short, I think the major challenge for the Biden administration going forward as it articulates its trade policy is to kind of square the circle with the competing desire to be active and show leadership in the Indo-Pacific region. Because frankly, our partners, including Japan and Korea, they want the United States to be a leader on trade, a leader on the economic dimensions of our not only bilateral relationships, but also the regional relationships. And that's something that the Biden administration is going to have to work hard on. I would just conclude and say, while the Biden administration thus far hasn't promoted new trade initiatives in the Indo-Pacific region, it is working hard on other economic initiatives, including infrastructure, technology development, resilient supply chains, and the like. So it doesn't mean we're absent on the economic front. It just means that the trade piece hasn't been figured out yet.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks for that overview. So the Biden administration is new, so hopefully this will be formulated some coherency in the near future. And then Professor Urata, what's the perspective from Japan?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in very important seminar. For Japan, I think the most important objective of its regional trade policy is to establish a free and open, transparent, rules-based trading system in the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific regions. Establishing such a trading system is the responsibility of the World Trade Organization, WTO, but the WTO has been able to play that expected role, mainly because of the differences of the opinions among WTO members. Under such circumstances, Japan considers that regional trade agreements or free trade agreements, FTAs, such as the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, which is a successor to the TPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCP, or we call it RCEP, they can play an effective role in establishing free and open trade environment. And Japan is a member of these two so-called mega FTAs. CPTPP involves 11 Asia-Pacific countries, such as Australia, Canada, Mexico, and Singapore and Vietnam, while RCEP involves 15 East Asian countries, including Korea, China, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nation, member countries, and Australia, and so on. And CPTPP entered into force in December 2018, while RCEP was signed in October last year, and now in the process of ratification. And I'd like to point out several challenges for the CPTPP and RCEP. As for CPTPP, 7 countries so far ratified the treaty, but the 4 countries are still in the process of ratification. These 4 countries are Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, Peru. And I'd like to see the ratification by these countries as soon as possible. United Kingdom officially applied to join the CPTPP. And I'd like to see Korea to join CPTPP. Although Wendy told us that the US is not likely to maybe come back to TPP or CPTPP in the near future, but I'd like to see, or the Japan like to see US to come back to this. And I'd like to point out several challenges for this RCP. One is India. India participated in the negotiation, but dropped out from negotiation in the late stage because of its opposition to the opening of its market to China. China is very competitive. And Japan like to see India return to the RCEP. And another challenge for the RCEP is to monitor the compliance of the rules by member countries once it is in action. It's still in the process of ratification. We'd like to see China to abide by the rules because many observers think that China accepted several rules which may be very difficult for them to comply with. For example, liberalization in trading services, investment, intellectual property rights, digital trade, and so on. Well, so these are some of the challenges that the CPTPP and RCEP are faced with. And like I said, Japan is a member of these 2 mega FTAs. And before I conclude, I'd like to mention Japan's new regional strategy. That is a free and open Indo-Pacific initiative. We call it FOIP. It was originally a security initiative, but it is expanded to include economic programs such as infrastructure building and establishment of free and open trading environment. This initiative, which involves India, the US, and Australia, among others, is considered to counter the Belt and Road Initiative by China. As India opted out from the RCEP, Japan hopes FOIP enables India to remain in the group of democratic countries. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Urata. And Professor Lim, from Korea, what are the priorities in regional trade policies?
Thanks, Tom. Well, Korea is a country with limited natural resources and a medium-sized domestic market. So it is important for Korea to engage in international trade and contribute to a rules-based trade regime, both regionally and globally. Also, as a divided peninsula in Northeast Asia, it is important for Korea to reduce tension between maritime and continental powers and promote regional cooperation so as to minimize the risks of conflict on the peninsula and facilitate reunification. And this kind of geopolitical thinking has guided Korea's foreign policy at least since the late 1980s, when Korea was democratized and U.S.-Soviet Cold War came to a close. However, there are now two big challenges, as Wendy and Professor Urata referred to. First, domestic politics in advanced industrial countries, especially in America, makes it difficult to promote regional or global trade agenda. Second, U.S.-China strategic competition, if not managed wisely, may precipitate another Cold War. So what should Korea do? I have recommendations for the short term and long term. In the short term, before further progress in U.S. jobs recovery and realistically, the U.S. midterm elections in November 2022, regional trade initiatives involving the United States are unlikely to gain much traction. People like Adam Posen, have tried to revitalize trade liberalization agenda, but I think we need to be realistic. Also, Korea already has bilateral or plurilateral free trade agreements with most of the major economies in the Asia-Pacific region. So in the short term, instead of expending efforts on new regional trade initiatives, I would recommend that Korea focus on pragmatic issues like regional vaccine cooperation and supply chain security. In the long term, I think it would be important to have a rules-based framework for cooperation that includes all the economies in the region for both security and economic reasons. And toward this end, I would recommend that Korea make serious efforts to promote regional trade initiatives that include both the United States and China. I mean, it's a long shot currently, but we already have RCEP and CPTPP, and in due course, I think we should work on revitalizing AFTA.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Lim. I'd like to first talk about bilateral relations, mainly between the Asian countries, Japan, Korea, and the U.S., and then go to the multilateral, go back to the multilateral discussion. So with the bilateral, the U.S. trade merchandise was $679 billion in 2020. And of that, Japan, the bilateral imbalance with Japan was 57 billion. Japan had a surplus, and Korea only 20 billion. By the way, China was 310, so it's most of it billion. But even though Korea and Japan's are much smaller than China, the U.S. Treasury Department continues to maintain Japan and Korea on its monitoring list of major trading partners that merit close attention to their currency practices. So my question is, in general, how much is this really an irritant to smooth trade relations? And second, more it's a policy question. The more basic question is, are these the underlying causes of the trade imbalances, are they from trade practices, unfair trade practices, or is it really macroeconomic forces in the U.S. that produce these perennial large trade imbalances? So with that, maybe I could go to Professor Lim for your comments. The Korea-U.S. trade relationship.
Right. I actually checked the figures, but the cited figures are somewhat misleading. $679 billion in 2020 That's the U.S. deficit for trade in goods and services, not just the goods trade. So, and I think it's important to include services as well as goods when we talk about trade, given the increasing importance of things like intellectual property, professional services, tourism, and so on. Now, according to the USTR, the U.S.-Korea bilateral trade in goods and services in 2020 totaled $155 billion. And the U.S. bilateral deficit was about $17 billion. U.S. ran a deficit of $25 billion in goods and a surplus of $8 billion in services. Now, as $17 billion bilateral deficit with Korea is about less than 3% of U.S. total trade deficit in 2020. $679 billion. So, I mean, it's less than 3%. I don't like to place much emphasis on bilateral trade balance, but even if you do so, it's less than 3% of the U.S. total trade deficit in 2020. And I don't think it's really a big deal between the two countries. Second, more fundamentally, a country's overall trade balance reflects macroeconomic forces, as we know, because that's the difference between the country's savings and investment from the GDP equation. So, U.S. overall trade balance reflects the gap between savings and investment. Now, when we get to bilateral trade deficits and surpluses, that largely reflect the comparative advantage of countries, but they also are affected by a variety of factors, including trade practices. So overall, I would say U.S.-Korea bilateral trade in goods and services is in good place now.
Right. Okay. Thanks for the clarifications on that. And Professor Urata, what's your take on this? The trade imbalances and this monitoring list that the U.S. Treasury maintains.
I'd like to respond to this question by addressing two points. One is bilateral trade imbalance, and the other is currency manipulation. Although it didn't mention currency manipulation, but this is, I think, what you meant. First, on bilateral trade imbalance, I think this is a political problem and not an economic problem. As Professor Lim said, overall trade, let me say this way, overall trade imbalance is an economic issue because overall trade imbalance reflects macroeconomic imbalances, which in turn are closely related to macroeconomic phenomena, such as inflation and unemployment. And so this is bilateral trade imbalance, to me, is not an economic issue. Having said this, I'd like to add that bilateral trade imbalances in many cases are a structural problem. Professor Lim said it reflects competitive advantage. I agree. Let me talk about Japan's experience in this. Japan has a bilateral trade deficit vis-a-vis oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and so on, because Japan doesn't have natural resources. But is it justified to try to remove this trade imbalance? I don't think so. So this is a bilateral trade imbalance, is a structural problem. And economists do not, in my view, do not really pay sufficient, maybe, attention to this. And that's, I think, right attitude. Well, turning to currency manipulation, and overall trade imbalances, I'd like to say that currency manipulation is bad because the government manipulates exchange rate to improve competitiveness of its exports, which in turn increases its overall trade surplus or reduce trade deficit. Although currency manipulation may increase its overall trade surplus or reduce deficit, I think its impact is rather short and will not last for long. I'd like to present a case where changes in exchange rates did not have significant impacts on trade balance in the long term. Japanese yen appreciated remarkably from 1970 to from the 1970s to the current period, present time. It was 360 yen to a dollar in 1970, and now it is around 100 yen to a dollar. So yen appreciated more than 300% vis-a-vis US dollars, but Japan still have bilateral trade surplus vis-a-vis US. So trade balance is a macroeconomic condition. It reflects macroeconomic condition. And this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I think the economics profession is pretty much in agreement on your point, as well as Professor Leem's observations. Wendy, do you have anything to add to this? You know, how important is this report? Does it influence trade negotiations? And do these bilateral imbalances impact the trade negotiations in any way?
Well, just a few points here. I think after the past 4 years, when there was such a great focus from the White House on bilateral trade deficits, I was hoping we wouldn't have to discuss this issue anymore because I think the points that both Professors Lim and Urata made are just on the mark. And you could have, you know, the best trade agreements, you could get rid of all the trade barriers with a country, and you could still have a growing bilateral trade deficit. And even with all of the tariffs we put in place against Chinese imports, yes, I mean, if you look at the actual data, the US trade deficit with China has come down a bit, but guess what? It's increased with other countries, and our overall global trade deficit, you know, has been increasing. So again, you know, this conversation, I'm just hoping that everyone realizes that, you know, you can't measure trade policies by looking at trade deficits, measure the effectiveness of trade policies. So that's number one. Number two, I think currency manipulation, if that policy is pursued by a country, is a serious matter and needs to be addressed. And Congress has instructed the Treasury Department to do these semi-annual reports with certain criteria. So they don't just politically say this country's manipulating, this country's not. They have specified criteria to follow to make that assessment. So yes, I think it's something that, you know, we all need to pay attention to. But a number of countries have been on this watch list for a number of years in the Treasury report and have never kind of raised to the level of being labeled then a currency manipulator. Right. And the final point I would just make, I think that looking forward in US trade agreements, we are going to be seeing administrations, including the Biden administration, most probably, to seek enforceable currency manipulation provisions in trade agreements. In other words, following the model of the USMCA, where countries agree to certain obligations not to manipulate their currency to gain an unfair trade advantage. And if they do so, they would be subject to the dispute settlement procedures of the respective agreement. So I think that kind of provision is here to stay, and we're going to see it in future trade agreements.
Right. Though again, those are very good points, Wendy. The monitoring list, just for the audience, I think there's 3 criteria: the bilateral trade deficit or balance with the U.S., the global trade position of all the countries, and then the currency intervention, whether there's asymmetrical one-way intervention in the FX markets by the central banks. I think on the latter category, Japan and Korea are okay. or at least they have been pretty much in recent years. So the focus to be on the monitoring list, unfortunately, or the emphasis is on, I think, unduly on the bilateral trade imbalances, but we all know the deficiencies in that. Before I turn back to the multilateral questions, I had one question for Professor Lim and Professor Urata. Over the past year or two, there's been trade friction between Japan and Korea, politically motivated, I think, or started with the Korean Supreme Court decision. And Japan taking Korea off a whitelist. Could you update us on where this stands and the health of the bilateral relationship between Japan and Korea? Maybe starting with Professor Lim.
Going back to the Korean Supreme Court decision, it differentiated between compensation for unpaid wages, pensions, and so on, which were covered by the 1965 agreement between Korea and Japan on the one hand, and on the other, solatium for the pain and suffering of forced laborers, okay, which was not covered by the 1965 agreement between Japan and Korea. So the Korean Supreme Court ruled that Japanese companies like Mitsubishi and Nippon Steel should pay solatium to forced laborers. Okay. Now, initially, at least Nippon Steel was willing to pay the solatium, even though they weren't, completely happy about the decision. But it is my understanding that the Japanese government persuaded the Japanese company to against it, basically. So this kind of state of limbo continued, and then Japan weaponized export restrictions on semiconductor materials that are crucial to the manufacturing of semiconductors for Korea. And it really escalated the situation. Right? And as you are referring to, Japan put Korea off the whitelist, okay? And there was a consumer boycott of Japanese products, but also at the same time, concerted effort on the part of Korean companies to try and localize the production of these critical semiconductor materials and seek other partners like DuPont for such supply. And this situation is continuing at the current moment. And I mean, we are hoping the negative spillovers don't continue, right? I won't continue, but that's the situation between Korea and Japan.
Okay, thanks, Professor Lim. And Professor Urata, can we get a
Yes,
Japanese perspective on this? And then just one follow-on: is this actually disrupting supply chains between the two countries? I guess it'd be global ramifications as well.
Okay, I think Professor Lim described the situation very correctly. And first on this 1965 agreement issue, Japanese government considers that's the final, that's done. Whereas the still case remains for maybe private companies. And I think that's the Japanese government position toward this issue. About the export restriction, first on the impact on supply chains, when I talk to, say, Japanese companies, which are, of course, which are suffering from this because they were not able to export products to Korea. But according to the information that I obtained, now it's back to normal, so to speak. So it's not really affecting that much. but I haven't really checked the statistics. Sorry, this is just an opinion that I heard
Sure.
from the companies.
If
And then,
if I may add to that quickly, I mean, Japanese companies like Tokyo Oka and Daikin are expanding operations in Korea.
right.
You know,
They increased their production in Korea, for example. And also some Japanese companies are importing materials from their plants in Europe. So Japanese companies are, so to speak, suffering from this too. They have to pay extra cost to supply their products to Korea. But again, so maybe this disrupted supply chain kind of, in several months or so, but now it's back to, I wouldn't say normal, but it's coming back. And what I understand is that Korean government has taken this case to the WTO. Is that correct? So we are still waiting. We meaning Japan and Korea are waiting to about the panel decision. I don't know when it is coming. Having said this, I wanted to see more kind of maybe formal or informal communications between two governments, maybe to deal with this kind of dispute. Taking this to, court, so to speak, or the panel or WTO dispute settlement mechanism in one way, and we have to accept the decision. But in addition, I wanted to see more, intensive communication between the government. This is something I wanted to say maybe in the question that I think he'll be asking, not just on specific case, but, more bilateral relationship between Korea and Japan in general. So for now, I think this is what I wanted to say.
Okay, well, hopefully this contentious relationship, these tensions, will be worked out. Turning to another contentious relationship, bilateral relationship, China. It's hard to talk about regional trade without talking about China. But before I get on to this question, which I'll address to Wendy Cutler, I'd like to remind the audience that if you have a question for our speakers, please send the questions in now to policy@koreasociety.org, and Korea Society is all run together. So it's policy@koreasociety.org.
Hey, Tom, if I can just
you want to
offer a couple
sure.
of comments on these previous comments.
Sure.
Number one, I would point to the fact that this dispute settlement case in the WTO, this could be settled in a very short time between the parties if the political will was there. It's not a legally complicated case. It's more kind of a political move. And I would hope that both parties could find a way to kind of sit down and settle this case. Second, I would just point to the language stressing the importance of trilateral cooperation in broad terms, both in the joint statements issued by President Biden and Prime Minister Suga when he visited Washington, followed by also appearing in the joint statement by President Biden and President Moon when he visited Washington about 10 days ago. I think this administration, unlike the previous administration, is going to be a little more involved in trying to encourage trilateral cooperation. And I'm hearing there may even be a meeting between the three leaders on the margin of the upcoming G7 meeting in the UK, which would be a good opportunity to try and get all parties to focus on kind of forward-looking initiatives and areas of common interest.
Okay, well, thanks, Wendy. That would be a constructive solution, hopefully, or that will lead to a constructive solution, the G7 meetings. So turning to the China-U.S. trade and maybe relation, and maybe we could talk about Japan versus China, Korea versus China, but the Biden administration has maintained the Trump tariffs, and the Trump tariffs are, 66%, the data that I've seen, I'm using 66% of imports from China into the US are covered by these tariffs. And Chinese imports from the US, like 58% are covered by tariffs, and the tariffs are 20-21%, so they're pretty high. The studies that I've read is that the tariffs are, to the American consumer and importers, are costly, counterproductive. And I think Professor Urata mentioned Adam Posen, at the head of the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He just calls them outright stupid. So why is the Biden administration maintaining these tariffs where a lot of other Trump policies were reversed almost on his first day in office?
Well, I mean, I think it's obvious. I think that there is kind of an overwhelming growing public sentiment in the United States that China is an unfair trading partner. We've taken action against China with these tariffs. And even though if they're hurting US interests, I think the view is by the administration that they need to review these tariffs and see if they're effective, but also to figure out the conditions under which they would lift the tariffs. I think they'll be under a lot of congressional scrutiny to show what they've gotten in return for lifting any tariffs. So in my view, I think I would love to see these tariffs at least slowly being lifted. And I put forward some ideas how this could be done. Number one, you could have a mini package where the US and China both agree to lift a certain percentage of their tariffs, or to lower the tariff rate on a certain basket of goods that are subject to tariffs. So the Biden administration can show Congress and other potential critics, look, what we've gotten in return is China now has lifted tariffs against US imports, which will facilitate more US exports to China. Also, there are a number of issues that were not fully addressed or frankly addressed at all in the phase one negotiations between the US and China. So if progress were being made in discussions between the US and China to address some of these practices and some of these barriers, I think that would provide a rationale for lifting these tariffs. But one thing I've learned throughout my career, it is so much easier to impose tariffs than to lift them. And that's one of the reasons why before anyone imposes tariffs going forward, I think, there's a lesson to be learned here. And it's not just the China tariffs. I mean, look at the steel and aluminum tariffs as well, which are hurting many US industries that use steel, including our automotive industry, that are paying the price while the steel companies are benefiting from these tariffs. So there are trade-offs within the economy, but once you put the tariffs on and you build up a constituency that's benefiting from them, or you're in a situation like the China tariffs, where you have Congress looking over the shoulders of the administration, it becomes very difficult to lift tariffs. I would just conclude by stressing that I'm hoping the Biden administration will reinstitute the tariff exclusion process for China tariffs. This process whereby US companies and other stakeholders could apply for temporary exclusions to the tariffs has expired. And I think as long as the tariffs look like they're going to be in place for a while, we really need to get that process back in place. And I think that would lessen the blow to certain US companies, workers, and other parties that are really suffering from these tariffs.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. So it's a very difficult political situation. And I also note that China's commitments under the phase one trade agreement are also lagging. So perhaps this will make it difficult too to find some sort of constructive solution that makes economic sense.
From my perspective, overall, I think China is making serious efforts to implement the obligations of the agreement. They are falling short of the purchasing obligations,
right.
But many of us thought from day one that those obligations, those targets were totally unrealistic.
Okay.
And frankly, the ability to achieve those targets in a COVID world, I think has just even become more complicated. But particularly if you look at Chinese imports of US agricultural goods, I mean, they are skyrocketing now. And at least in that sector, China's getting much closer to fulfilling its purchasing commitments.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Wendy. Turning to Professor Urata, what other political tensions in the Japan-China bilateral trade relationship?
Well, not a trade relationship, I don't think. Of course, we have, frictions in other areas, but as far as trade is concerned, I don't think we have serious trade disputes between two countries.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. And Professor Lim, political tensions within the Korea-China bilateral trade relationship. Could you offer observations on that?
Well, back in 2004, there was some tension between Korea and China over the ancient kingdom of Goguryeo. Goguryeo is part of Korea's history and so on. And two countries managed to work out, something. And more recently, over the deployment of THAAD, the missile defense, there was retaliation from China, and some of that is continuing. I mean, the legacy effect on tourism and so on is continuing on top of COVID and stuff. But overall, trade relations between Korea and China are in good shape, I would say.
Okay, good.
Can I just come in a minute?
Yeah, sure, Professor.
This is not the trade disputes per se, but maybe this applies to Korea too. Japan thinks that our dependence on China is too much. So, partly because of COVID, we realize it is very important for Japan to reduce its economic or trade dependence on China. Mm-hmm. So, Japanese government introduced some measures to kind of help Japanese companies to diversify their production sites away from China. Mm-hmm. Maybe some coming back to Japan, some going to other countries like Vietnam. So that is the, I think, issue which Japan and Japanese companies and Japanese governments are faced with at the moment vis-a-vis China. Okay,
good. I think we'd go on for a long time, but I do want to get to the multilateral part. What's the relative significance of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, if I got that right, and the other big acronym, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership? Superficially, I noticed RCEP is new. TPP seems to be a more robust trade agreement, at least my impression. But RCEP includes China, and CPTPP does not include China or South Korea, for that matter. So, which one of these organizations will take the lead in developing trade and institutions and regulations that govern trade in Asia? And maybe I could start with Professor Urata on this, since Japan is a member of
both agreements. As I said earlier, CPTPP or TPP is in action now. It's been put into force, whereas RCEP is still in the ratification process. So obviously, CPTPP went ahead. And in terms of, say, quality of agreements, here again, CPTP is higher in a sense. It covers more than what RCEP does. For example, state-owned enterprises is a very important, maybe serious issue for China, for other countries too. CPTPP has a chapter on state-owned enterprises, whereas RCEP doesn't. So this is just one example. And in terms of tariff elimination, trade liberalization. Here again, CPTPP almost say 99% of the tariff will be eliminated with some grace period, whereas the RCEP has a lower tariff elimination scheme. So obviously, CPTPP is maybe ahead in terms of quality, timing, and so on. So that's how the relationship between these two. Having said this, I like to say it is important for East Asian countries to have RCEP because, like you said, China is in it. And many countries like to see China comply with the commitments. This is maybe one possible way to deal with some of the so-called unfair trade practices like IPR and so on. So again, both are important, but in terms of quality and timing, CPTPP is ahead of RCEP.
Okay, thanks. And Professor Lim?
Yeah, in October 2015, in his statement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, then President Barack Obama said, I quote, when more than 95% of our potential customers live outside the United States, live outside our borders, we can't let countries like China write the rules of the global economy. We should write those rules. And President Obama added and defended and promoted the TPP as an agreement that puts American workers first and will help middle-class families get ahead. So, the worker-centric, middle-class-centric trade agenda, at least in rhetoric, was in place in October 2015. But as we all know, Trans-Pacific Partnership did not receive enough support from both Democrats and Republicans. And Donald Trump withdrew the United States, President Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement in 2017. Now, as Professor Urata mentioned, although the other 11 members of the group have since signed a comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, it is not clear that the Biden administration would be willing and able to sell this agreement as something that puts American workers first and will help middle-class families get ahead. And in the meantime, Britain is showing interest in joining the CPTPP. So, geographically, it becomes more than Trans-Pacific agreement if Britain comes in. And even more significantly, China is showing interest in joining the CPTPP. Now, it remains to be seen whether China will be willing to accept more stringent provisions on things like state-owned enterprises, subsidies, intellectual property, and so on of the CPTPP as a condition for joining the CPTPP. But it's an interesting development. And I think the United States has to make its position clear on this. Because, is China possibly joining the CPTPP, sort of a third rail, or is it something of a positive development if China is willing to accept and abide by the stringent rules? And where is America going with respect to a trade agreement like CPTPP? Now, on RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as Professor Urata mentioned, it brings in ASEAN 10 countries, China, and 4 American allies, Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. So from a geopolitical view, my take on the RCEP is that it is an important step toward calming down concerns about U.S.-China Cold War and restoring prospects for a more inclusive architecture as represented by FTAC, or Free Trade Agreement of the Asia Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And given the risk of intensifying U.S.-China tension in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, I think China was relieved to have the RCEP agreement. And I also believe that the other countries were happy to reach this agreement. But at the same time, the other members would like to have the United States involved in a mega regional so that they could reduce the risk of depending on China too much. So that's where we are at. And CPTPP and RCEP could be building blocks potentially, but it depends a lot on how domestic politics plays out in the United States and what the US decides to do with regard to mega regionals.
Okay, well, thanks, Professor Lim. In the remaining few minutes, we might have to go into overtime here. I'd like to close up with Wendy, and maybe Wendy, you could quickly answer. I mean, Professor Lim's question. You know, would China, if China were to join or look likely to join the CPTPP, would that induce the U.S. to look at it afresh? But I'd also like to hear your view on how the WTO, what role the WTO will play in the regional trade relationships, but also the global trade relationships in the next year or two. I know that there are basic reforms that the WTO has to address. You know, the role of state subsidies, SOEs, the special and differential treatment for self-designated developing countries, which includes China, and also the dispute settlement. But the WTO's priority, my understand, is the coronavirus vaccine patent waiver issue, which public health experts think it's not enough to increase production of vaccines. Regardless of what the experts think, what's your view on the future of the U.S. and Asia and the future of the WTO, the near-term future of the WTO?
I have 2 minutes, right?
2 minutes, yeah. Well, hopefully maybe our audience can stay several minutes later.
Just a couple of comments. First, look, with respect to China and the CPTPP, I think we all need to be honest here. If anything, China's economy is moving more and more towards more state involvement, not only with respect to SOEs, but with respect to private companies. We've also seen, despite having a free trade agreement between Australia and China, China is just, hitting a variety of Australian imports into China, as well as, taking other measures against Australia. So these are just a couple of data points. Also, let's be honest, with respect to the WTO, China has not been an enthusiastic partner about strengthening rules with respect to transparency or subsidies or other areas. And so if China is interested in joining the CPTPP, and given the high level obligations in the agreement, I don't think it's because China wants to reform and to join this club to reform, although I think, there's still some folks in China that truly believe that's what they should be doing. I think it's more to, have a seat at the table of another mega trade agreement. So I would hope the other CPTPP countries keep their eyes open here and remember that the whole idea of inviting more countries into the agreement was based on the premise that they were ready and prepared to take on the high-level obligations of the agreement. I think the United States should be paying very serious attention to China's moves here with respect to the CPTPP. Because I don't think, given the high level expression of interest, this isn't something to be taken lightly. And just briefly with respect to the WTO, in my view, it's kind of a make it or break it year for the WTO. You have a new director general. She's very enthusiastic. She's trying to really push things forward. You have a new USTR with the US now, after 4 years, being constructively engaged and taking a leadership role in the WTO. And you have an upcoming WTO ministerial in November, hopefully, which will be an action forcing event for some real deals to be made. I would just conclude, given the topic of this webinar, I think the WTO is a great venue for Japan-Korea cooperation on economic matters. I think both Japan and Korea have benefited enormously from the rules-based system of the WTO. They have a lot of common interests, whether it be e-commerce or other negotiations. So I would hope that this would be an area where we could see Japan and Korea cooperating closely going forward.
That's good to hear. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground and shed a lot of insight and understanding. Jonathan, why don't you take over the Q&A now?
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you for all of our guests who are sending in lots and lots of questions. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to release them in batches. I'll start with 2 questions, and then I'll give our speakers an opportunity to chime in on the things that you feel motivated to respond to. So let's start with this question about the WTO. This comes to us from Professor Christina Davis from Harvard University. She asked, do you feel there's a need for WTO members to negotiate an understanding for how to balance national security concerns and trade rules? She asks about, this is an interesting idea, do you see a new form of COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, being negotiated? And if so, would Japan, Korea, and the United States have a common position towards China? So does anyone have any thoughts on that one? I see Professor Lim nodding. Do you want to go first on this one?
On like security issues, I mean, we should recall that the Trump administration justified the steel and aluminum tariffs on the basis of national security grounds, right? So basically, the argument was that steel and aluminum industries are critical to national security, and the current domestic capacity utilization in those industries is not up to the target level, consistent with national security. So we are going to put tariffs or quotas on these critical products. That was the argument. And I mean, before this use of national security argument for tariffs and quotas was avoided based on sort of a gentleman's agreement, not due to the provisions in the WTO. There's a provision for justifying tariffs and quotas based on national security, but most major economies didn't use that provision so readily. So I think it would be important to try and specify the criteria for the use of national security argument for trade restrictions, because once you justify tariffs on steel and aluminum like that, you could use that argument for automobiles. You could use that for, I don't know, critical chemicals and so on. So there has to be some movement on that. On COCOM, I mean, that kind of, brings back the good old Cold War days. And at least up to this point, Korea has been trying to, given the narrowing technology gap, and in some areas, China has already surpassed Korea in terms of technology. Korea is very sensitive about guarding its technology edge. And it would be important to try and maintain that kind of technology edge. But if you are going to have whole COCOM list of large areas of technology that could have both civilian and military use, that could be a very complex matter. So, Korea hasn't gotten to that, debate yet.
Understood. Yeah, let's turn to Wendy.
If I can just add on the WTO and the national security exception, I couldn't agree more that there's, been abuse of this provision, not just by the United States, however. I mean, China uses national security a lot to justify restrictions with respect to the internet and other technology areas. And so I agree with a lot of what Professor Lim said, but the one thing I'd be very, very skeptical, and I think would add an enormous hardship to the WTO, would be to ask the WTO to kind of negotiate new parameters for the use of national security. The WTO negotiating plate is full. They're having a hard time negotiating on an issue like fish subsidies, where which has been under discussion for 19 years, and maybe we'll see an agreement this year. And what I would like to see is we kind of go back to where we were. And you mentioned this kind of gentleman's agreement, maybe I can call it a gentle person's agreement, whereby, countries just agree to, restrain their use of this provision. But to ask the WTO to renegotiate the national security provision, I fear could almost lead to the demise of the WTO.
Can I just add to what's been said? Yes, I think it'll be too much or too difficult for WTO to deal or say define what national security is, or national security exception is. Having said this, I think these discussions or debates on national security go on, say among democratic countries. Maybe U.S. can lead discussions, involving Japan, Korea, Australia, and so on. And then they can maybe set their own rules on national security. What I'm trying to say is it's very difficult for China to come in and to join US-led group in defining national security. So maybe, in the end, it'll be a kind of national security definition or rules among democratic countries on the one hand, or maybe similar arrangement among China and China-led groups. And there will be, maybe it's very difficult to have a global definition or global definition of national security.
Thank you. That's a good point.
Hey, Jonathan, we're into overtime. I hope Wendy and Wonhyuk and Shujiro have time to answer maybe another question or two. How are we doing?
I see nods from all of our speakers who are incredibly gracious, and our YouTube audience is sticking around too. So thank you, YouTube audience. So let's keep going. So what I'll do is I'll ask this next batch of questions all at once. I'll tell you 3 questions, and then I'll go one at a time, and you could tell me which ones you'd like to respond to. Feel free to respond to as many as you'd like. Okay, so let's start with a question from Jennifer Boone. Jennifer would like to know, we already have a free trade agreement with Korea. We have a stage 1 agreement with Japan. What is the likelihood that we'll see a full trade agreement with Japan during the Biden administration? Okay, so that's question 1. Question number 2 comes from Mark Mannion at CRS. Mark would like to ask, what is Japan's attitude towards the prospect of Korea joining CPTPP? And then the last question is on Section 232 tariffs. This comes from Mara Lee, congressional reporter at International Trade Today. Mara asks, how big an irritant are the Section 232 tariffs on Japanese and Korean steel at this point? Do the Japanese and Korean governments feel that inexpensive steel from China is a major problem, or are China steel inputs helpful for Korean and Japanese steelmakers who do further processing to make finished steel products? Okay, so those are the 3 questions. If we could start with the first one, which is about the potential for a full-fledged free trade agreement between the U.S. and Japan. Are there any? Yes, let's go to Wendy.
I can be pretty brief here. The viewer is correct that during the Trump administration, there was an agreement that there would be kind of a phase 2 negotiation with Japan working towards a comprehensive trade agreement. I really question the utility of it given that we don't have a lot of kind of bilateral irritants between the United States and Japan now. Both countries have limited bandwidth in the trade space. And I think joint efforts with Japan would be much more fruitful if we worked on issues, pressing issues and emerging issues facing the regional trade landscape as well as global trade issues. The one exception I can see, although I don't think Tokyo would like this, would be to negotiate kind of a new phase 2 agreement, which is kind of the model worker-centric trade agreement for the United States, meaning we would kind of build, using USMCA as a floor, we would add on kind of the other novel ideas that Washington has in order to produce a trade agreement that truly works for the middle class and for workers. But again, I'm not sure if that's the kind of agreement that Tokyo would be interested in negotiating with us.
Well, USMCA has various interesting features like currency manipulation chapter, right? And then I think you cannot really negotiate with China. But although Japan and China already has a RCEP, so that doesn't apply. I mean, that kind of clause from USMCA doesn't apply to Japan and US. But from Japan's side, what Japan wanted from the U.S.-Japan trade agreement is automobile, as Wendy knows, because U.S. agreed in the TPP that the U.S. will remove or reduce tariffs on autos, but U.S. Didn't offer that in the U.S.-Japan trade deal. So that's one thing Japan wants to have. Having said this, Japan is not interested, or Japan is concerned with opening up a services sector, to be frank. So there's not much maybe interest from Japan's side in having maybe second stage of the U.S.-Japan trade agreement. Japan is more interested in U.S. coming back to the CPTPP, I would say.
Okay, so let's turn to the next question, which is Japan's perspective on Korea joining the CPTPP.
Well, Japan certainly wants Korea to join CPTPP because Japan and Korea can really, can gain benefits from having, say, Korea into CPTPP for various reasons. Say, CPTPP has a very high quality rules, digital trade, and so on. And if Korea joins CPTPP, as you may know, China, Japan, Korea are negotiating CJK trilateral FTA. And in that FTA, what I like to see is high quality rules, like a digital trade. So if and when Korea joins CPTPP, Korea and Japan get together to kind of, put pressure on China on these rules. So again, if Korea joins CPTPP, Japan and Korea can be more cooperative, and then they can maybe achieve economic gains. So I think that's what I want to say about Korea joining CPTPP.
Great, thank you. Any response to that and Korea's perspective, perhaps?
Yeah, well, Korea and Japan both joined RCEP and have worked on trade issues together. So yeah, it'll be good. And Korean government has already expressed its interest in joining CPTPP, so it'll be good.
Excellent. Okay, so let's turn to our last question, which is about Section 232. How big an irritant are they? This comes to us from Mara Lee. Any thoughts here?
Sure. Well, I mean, Korean steel producers are not happy about it, but at the same time, they understand the lobbying power of the steel industry in the United States, and also the upcoming midterm elections in the United States. So I mean, it'd be good if these tariffs could be phased out, but realistically, you know, Korean companies don't see them being lifted, you know, this year, really. So yeah, so that's where we are.
Yes, I think I have the same opinion on this tariff for national security reasons. But I guess Wendy said earlier, you know, protection doesn't really lead to a good solution in this case. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, protection is given to, of course, to protect steel industry, hoping that steel industry will come back competitive. But that doesn't happen. What we need is the structural adjustment, so to speak. What we need, maybe in the medium to long term, is to shift, you know, steel workers from steel production to more productive activities. That is easy for me to say, but it's very difficult to accomplish. But that's the kind of policy that not only the United States, Japan, Korea, the countries need to implement to you know, move ahead to grow economically. And I think that's a message I wanted to give to the U.S. Policymakers. I'm sure that they understand, but it is very difficult to do it. But this is something they have to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wendy Cutler, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just conclude and say that to lift the tariffs, the United States is going to need to show that they're working with others to address the problem, which is Chinese excess capacity in the steel and aluminum sectors and other sectors as well. And so I would hope that we could work with Korea, Japan, Europe, and others to really pressure China to deal with its overcapacity problem in steel. And I think that would pave the way towards the US lifting. And I go back to what I said earlier, easy to impose tariffs, hard to lift them, and to lift them, you need to show what you got in return. And with respect to steel, let's go back to the reason why we imposed the tariffs in the first place was to deal with global overcapacity by China.
Well, as far as steel is concerned, I mean, previous U.S. administrations put tariffs or restrictions on Chinese steel exports to the United States. And as a result, imports from other countries increased, import flows from other countries increased into the United States. So, I mean, it's one thing to say overcapacity of China, which could be real, but the problem may have more to do with a competitive position of the U.S. steel industry.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Tom, would you like to make any?
Sure. Well, I guess we're well into overtime. The NHL is having its Stanley Cup playoffs, and some of the best games go into overtime. So I really have to thank Wonhyuk, Wendy, and Shujiro for the comprehensive, progressive, and illuminating discussion that we've had today on these really critical issues for the prosperity and political well-being of all our three great countries. So thanks for joining us, and thanks for staying into overtime. And hopefully we can continue these discussions in the near future.